Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA, the Washington International Trade Association. We are very grateful to all of you for joining us today. We're grateful to the weather for holding off and not causing us to have to make any changes in our plans. Very grateful to Clete for joining us today for this really important conversation. Actually, Clete, I want to say we're actually grateful to everything the administration is doing because it's keeping WITA really busy as well. So thank you for your incredibly energetic trade policy and the interest that the trade community is showing. And we're trying to play our part in helping educate the public and the policymakers about what's happening on international trade in the United States and around the world. And you're giving us plenty of fodder, so thank you for that. With that in mind, I want to remind folks, I know your inbox are full of it, but we are having our first ever Washington International Trade Conference on January 29th. There's information on the WITA website, www.wita.org, as well as on your tables. We hope you'll consider joining us for that event. Hope you might even think about sponsoring that event. We think it'll be, we hope to make it a regular part of the trade calendar every year. Also, I haven't gone public with this yet, but we hope to be holding our annual Congressional Trade Councils program on March 1st. Save the date. Don't lock it in pen, but you can put it in pencil at this point. We hope to be able to have that on March 1st. Thanks, as always, for everything we do here in the Ronald Reagan Building to our good friends at the International Trade Center here at the Ronald Reagan Building for working with us on making all our programming a success. With that, I'm going to turn the program over in a second, invite up Clete Willems. You know, I was looking, Clete, at your bio, trying to pick out one thing to focus on. Everybody in the room has it. And the thing that jumped out at me was a BA in chemical engineering. And I was thinking to myself, with your job, the ability to understand how volatile things come together and make things that don't explode is actually probably a really good skill to have. And I think we were all very grateful that you're in the position you're in helping manage that mix of things that are all coming together in the White House. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Clete Willems. When he's done with his remarks, he'll take a seat and be joined by Michael Smart, and we'll have a conversation and hopefully have a few minutes for questions at the end. Clete?
Thanks for everyone for being here. You know, chemical engineering makes this stuff look easy. Anyway, I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the G20 summit in Argentina. Across the board, it was really a tremendous success for the president and for the entire administration. In today's remarks, I'd like to focus on three different areas where we were particularly successful. First is the negotiations on the communique and the related discussions that were had among the leaders. Second is the signing of the USMCA. And third are the president's bilateral meetings. And I have a hunch that there's one bilateral meeting in particular that you all are going to want to talk about, so we can cover that. As most of you know, as the Sherpa, my job down in Argentina was to negotiate the communique on behalf of the president. And I think the name Sherpa is pretty appropriate. You do a ton of work, you carry a heavy load, and no one really notices until you screw up. And when I got back from Argentina, everyone said, "How was it? Did you enjoy the steak? How was the Malbec?" And the reality was I spent about 5 days straight in a windowless room. I think we ordered pizza a couple times at 3 in the morning, and we had tough discussions. But I think as thankless as that can be, and as trivial as it might seem, it's really quite important, because these discussions that we have, if they work well, each Sherpa is mimicking the perspectives and the views that their leaders have. And so it really is an opportunity to thoroughly explain where your leader's coming from on some of the most important issues of the day. And ultimately, if you're successful, you can try to get a consensus on how to approach these issues moving forward. And down in Argentina, we were successful. And we were able to get a consensus communique that did some really important things, and some really important things on behalf of this administration. One that I know everyone in this room is interested in, and I think really is the headline coming out of this, is the discussion and the language that we got on trade reform. And as many of you know, The U.S. concerns about the WTO and the multilateral trading system more generally are longstanding, and they're well known. We are concerned that if the system is not reformed, it won't be viable, and that will be a worse situation for all of us. And so we've set out to try to address these problems. I want to just give you a couple quick examples of some of the problems of the system that I think are worth thinking about, and I think they really underscore how severe the situation is. The first is the monitoring mechanism. It's pretty hard to say the monitoring mechanism is living up to its objectives when a whole range of countries fail to follow even the most basic transparency requirements to notify subsidies and state-owned enterprises. When you look at the negotiating function, it's hard to argue that that is operating at the level it should, when we've essentially had one major agreement since the WTO was created, one major bilateral agreement, and we have a situation where a lot of countries approach these negotiations with the stated intent of not liberalizing their economies, but protecting their right to protect their economies and clinging on to developing country status in a way that I think is not productive and doesn't reflect reality. And then, of course, there's the dispute settlement system, and I think I could go on and on that for a while. I think USTR has done a great job of articulating both substantive and procedural concerns with that system, and so I won't spend time on that today. But what I want to say is, in light of these major concerns, it was significant and historic that for the first time ever, all members of the G20 unambiguously stated the multilateral trading system is currently falling short of its objectives, and it's necessary to reform the WTO to improve its functioning. It's obviously easy to understand why we would support this, but it is historic when that statement is endorsed by leaders from China, from India, Brazil, South Africa, those who historically have been positioned and have been opposed to any kind of reform. And then, of course, there's the European Union. And not only did the EU endorse this statement, but you heard leaders from the EU across the board, Chancellor Merkel, President Macron, Prime Minister May, talking about in their interventions how we needed to fix the system to address the problems of today. And I think that is really significant, and I think those of you who believe in the importance of a functioning WTO should be encouraged. Now, I'd like to take credit for all this as the Sherpa, but the reality is I think a lot of credit goes to Ambassador Lighthizer and the positions he's taken at the WTO. And I don't think we'd be in the situation that we are with the impetus for reform if he had not taken the difficult stances that he's taken on the appellate body and other issues. And so he deserves a lot of credit, and I think that the message that he's been giving is starting to resonate. Of course, these are simply statements by leaders, and it's important that that translate into action. And we have a long way to go, but as they always say, the first step is recognizing you have a problem. And so I'm optimistic. The second issue in the communique I want to touch on is the language around infrastructure investment. And during the summit, the United States consistently highlighted the need for infrastructure financing to be transparent, accountable, and to not lead to unsustainable levels of debt in developing countries. This has taken on particular significance in light of certain unnamed state-led financing initiatives around the world that make grandiose promises, but often leave the recipient of that funding worse off. In Sri Lanka, there's a situation where China gained a strategic asset after building a port that wasn't financially sustainable. You have a situation in Kenya where there's a railroad that was built that probably isn't going to be affordable for that country, and it was done with Chinese labor, Chinese equipment, and ultimately will give China an advantage for their extractive industries. There's a lot of other examples I could give, but I think we've been clear about our concern about that problem. We also haven't been shy about the need for a viable alternative, and we've taken steps to try to provide it. As many of you may know, the President recently signed the BUILD Act, which I think is the most significant piece of international economic development legislation in the last 15 years. This is a bipartisan bill that will significantly modernize and enhance the U.S. development finance toolkit, centered at OPIC, so we can provide countries with an alternative that promotes market principles and leads to sustainable development outcomes, all without any strings attached. And at the summit, the United States worked with others, with Japan, with European allies, and we successfully pushed China to commit to doing quality infrastructure, to doing it on terms that are transparent, and to make sure that it doesn't lead to unsustainable levels of debt. We also got a statement in there calling on both the IMF and the World Bank to add more transparency into their programs to make sure that countries aren't coming to them because they've taken on these kinds of bad loans. So I think that was a really significant achievement as well. Another area I'd like to touch on was women's economic empowerment. This has been a key administration priority, championed by the advisor to the president, Ivanka Trump, and she's going to be launching a new White House-led international initiative next month that's focused on women in the workforce, women entrepreneurs, and creating an enabling environment where women can be successful in business. And in the communique, we got really strong language committing to working with the private sector to promote access to quality and affordable care infrastructure, parental leave. There's also language talking about the importance of promoting women into leadership and decision-making programs within companies, and also promoting STEM education. On workforce development, we got great language reinforcing the president's efforts. As you may know, in July, the president launched the Pledge to America's Workers, which called on businesses nationwide to invest in their current and future workforce through reskilling and educating Americans of all ages. And to date, we're very proud. Over 180 companies have signed the pledge and created nearly 6.5 million new opportunities for our workers. And the G20's communique talked about the importance of these types of programs and reskilling. Another area where we were successful was on energy and climate. And in particular, we had consensus that all sources of energy can play a role in economic growth, energy security, and energy access, that each country can take its own path to promoting cleaner energy systems. And so that was a big accomplishment for us. And where there was some difficulty is very interesting. It's not surprising that climate was a sticking point in these negotiations. And typically, in the past, sometimes the U.S. has been one of the last countries to be able to close a statement because of these issues. But that wasn't the case here. We simply, clearly recognized our position that we believe in emissions reduction, but we think that it needs to be done in a way that doesn't harm the economy. And we reaffirmed our position on the Paris Agreement. I think the U.S. track record on emissions speaks for itself, and we articulated that down there. And let me just give you one fact here. U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions have fallen by 14% since 2005, even as our economy has grown by 19%. So it shows that we can balance those things, and we simply made a statement recognizing that in the communique. But the other countries were the ones who couldn't agree with each other. And I think that the U.S. message on some of the difficulties with the Paris Agreement are starting to resonate. And you had countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, and even Australia who seem to be openly questioning that paradigm. And this language only closed among them after conversations at the leader level up to the very last minute. And so I think that hopefully gives you some context of what we were able to achieve in the communique, and I think across the board it was a great success for us. Moving on to the USMCA. Signing that agreement down there was a historic accomplishment for the president. The first time we've renegotiated whole scale a major US FTA. And what we've achieved really is the gold standard. The USMCA is going to make America the most competitive, free, fair, and reciprocal trading bloc in the world. Full stop. And I think it's important to think about the context here. For years, past presidents, members of Congress have complained about various aspects of the NAFTA agreement. They've talked about its shortcomings, how it's left people behind, how it hasn't addressed modern trade issues, but no one's really done anything about it. And we have a president who came in here, who made those statements, but actually followed through. And I think that's something quite remarkable. And not only did he follow through, but we achieved a absolutely across the board tremendous result in a record amount of time. And let me give you a couple highlights. On IP, we've got groundbreaking provisions and data protection, 10 years for biologics compared to only 5 that was achieved in the TPP. On agriculture, we have unprecedented standards for biotech, significantly expanding market access in Canada for dairy, which was a key complaint about the past agreement. We have the strongest disciplines on digital trade of any FTA in the world. On financial services, we have a across-the-board ban on data localization, something that wasn't achieved in the past. On labor and environment, we have enforceable, strong provisions. I think they're ambitious, they're progressive, and they meet the demands of what Democrats have been calling for years. On currency, we're finally addressing that in a meaningful, substantive, enforceable way in the agreement. And on autos, an area where there's been a lot of concern about the impact of NAFTA, we have increased the regional content requirements, and we now have provisions that are going to bring manufacturing back to the United States. So this is a significant accomplishment for the administration, for the American people. And I think this is something that deserves strong bipartisan support, and I'm confident that it's going to get it. Because, as my boss Larry Kudlow likes to say, if you're a Republican, there's a time to like it here. There are groundbreaking provisions across the board. If you're a Democrat and you support the working man and women in this world, you're going to support this because of the really strong labor provisions in here. So we're confident, and we look forward to working with Congress and to all of you in the business community on moving this forward. Finally, I'd like to talk about the bilaterals that the President had in Argentina. He had meetings with President Macri from Argentina, Chancellor Merkel from Germany, President Moon from Korea, Prime Minister Morrison from Australia, Prime Minister Abe from Japan, and Prime Minister Modi from India. And each of these were successful in many ways. And then, of course, you might have heard of this meeting with President Xi from China. I think it's gotten a little bit of attention in recent days. And a lot of people have said a lot of things about this meeting, including the President, including a range of cabinet members in the United States. And I don't think it's going to be particularly enlightening for any of you for me simply to repeat what's already been said. What I'd like to do instead is just make a couple high-level observations that I hope will be helpful to put things in perspective. First is the importance of personal chemistry. Personal chemistry is critical to have a successful negotiation. And I think that the personal rapport between President Trump and President Xi was noticeable, and it's clear that these two individuals respect each other, they get along, and that is a very positive thing, and it makes me optimistic about what the future holds. Second, it's important that everyone realize this is about structural issues. That is why we are here, and that is going to be critical to any resolution to this matter. And during the meeting, President Trump clearly articulated the need for China to address structural issues that the United States has raised, such as forced technology transfer, theft of American intellectual property, cyber intrusions of U.S. commercial networks, unjustified retaliatory tariffs, and other non-tariff barriers. Other things are important, but this is at its core about structural issues, and that's the way that this is going to be resolved. And I thought it was important that President Xi personally engaged on these structural issues in response. It's one thing for us to talk about it, or even for cabinet members to talk about it, but it's a whole other thing when the leaders are actually talking about these issues, and I think that's significant. And especially in China, it's important that the way that the government works, that they hear from the top that these are issues that are on the table and that need to be discussed. And I don't want to downplay the other issues that are part of this, but at its core, this is all about structural issues. The third thing I'd say is it's important that we focus on actions and not merely words. In the days following these meetings, of course, there was a lot of consternation about the different things that were said and differences in wording and in ways that people described what happened down there. And let me be clear. We've had situations before where the United States and China agreed to very specific language that China would commit to stopping forced technology transfer, and that didn't translate into results. So let's look at actions, and let's not focus merely on words. Same thing goes for the United States. And instead of trying to dissect every comment that every one of us makes, I think it's important to keep in perspective what happened. Going into the meeting, we were planning on raising tariffs on January 1. Coming out of the meeting, there was an agreement, as the President has noted in his statement, that will be delayed to provide space for these conversations. So let's focus on the big picture and not every single thing that is said by every single person. Finally, I think it's also a matter of perspective to think about the context of what we're doing in light of the broader economic situation in the United States. As is clear, we have a booming economy. And let me give you a couple of facts and figures. We've added 4.6 million new jobs since the election. We're in the middle of the longest positive job growth streak on record. The unemployment rate in the United States is 3.7%. This is the lowest rate since 1969. We've added 468,000 new manufacturing jobs under President Trump, which compares quite favorably to the 200,000 that were lost in the previous administration. We have an annualized growth rate of 3.3% and are on track for the highest calendar year growth rate in 13 years. Wage growth is up. I can go on and on. But I think you get the point. And the point is, if not now, when? We have a perfect situation where we have a thriving economy, where we are in a position of strength, and if there are any shocks, we're in a position to absorb them. And so now is the time that we have to take on these festering issues. We don't want to wait. We don't want to wait for 10 more years of unfair trade practices and see where that puts us. Now is the time to take this on. And I think that if we do take this on, the ultimate place that we land is going to be better for everyone. It's going to be much better for economic growth and for American businesses over the long run if China addresses some of these systemic problems. It's going to be much better for China as well. And we've said to China on many occasions, this isn't the United States trying to keep you down. We want to see you grow. We want to see you lift people out of poverty. You just can't do so in a way that harms the American worker, that harms American businesses, and harms businesses around the world. So I'm optimistic, but we have to be realistic, and we have a long way to go. So with that, I hope that's given you a helpful narrative on some of the things that happened down in Argentina, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.